Hi, I'm Dave Eck. In this video I'm going to show you how to use my Digital Setting Circles ASCOM driver with Stellarium and your telescope mount so that you can easily find objects in the night sky using your telescope. Digital Setting Circles systems consist of hardware and software that allow you to connect your telescope to your computer, giving your computer the ability to accurately determine where your telescope is pointed. This is a great aid to finding objects in the night sky, especially objects that are difficult to star hop to. There are a number of commercial Digital Setting Circles systems available right now, including Orion's Intelliscope, Celestron's Advanced Astromaster, and others. Most of these systems are standalone. They have a little box with a display and some buttons to interact with, but they can also connect directly to your computer, and that's what I'm going to show you in this video. If you'd like to learn more about Digital Setting Circles systems, go to my website, xfiles.net. That's eksfiles.net, and then click on the Digital Setting Circles link. That'll take you to a page that contains some general information about Digital Setting Circles systems and how they work. It will also show you some information about the Digital Setting Circles system that I designed that you can build for yourself if you're so inclined. But while you're here, click on the ASCOM driver for Digital Setting Circles link, and then scroll down and click on Download the ASCOM driver for Digital Setting Circles. We're going to need this in order to proceed. Before we install the ASCOM driver, though, we need to install the ASCOM platform itself. So go to ascom-standards.org and then click the download button to download the ASCOM platform. The installer is easy to run. I'm not going to show you that here, just accept all of the defaults. And then go back and install the ASCOM driver that we downloaded in the previous step. Once you've installed the ASCOM platform and the ASCOM driver for Digital Setting Circles, it's time to install the Stellarium software. Go to stellarium.org and click on the download link at the top of the window, either for the 32-bit or 64-bit version for Windows. Use the 64-bit version if you have a 64-bit system. The Stellarium software is installed easily as well. Just run the installer and choose the defaults. So once we have all of the software installed, it's time to make it all work together. So let's start by launching Stellarium. We've got Stellarium up right here, and there's a few things that we need to do before we get too far, but let me just say that Stellarium is a great planetarium package for Windows PCs. It has a ton of capability. It can really help you with your observing sessions, so take some time to learn everything that it can do and figure out how to use it. I'm not going to cover everything that you can do with Stellarium here. I'm just going to cover some of the finer points of using it with your telescope. So let's start by going over with our mouse to the left side of the screen and then selecting Location Window. It's important to make sure that Stellarium knows what your observing location is, so make sure that you've set it here. Also, make a note of the latitude and longitude that you've specified, because we're going to need those a little bit later. In this case, I have it set to my location at Woodland Park, Colorado, 39 degrees north, 105 degrees west. So get that set and then go ahead and close the window. And then we're going to go back over to the left and select the configuration window. In the configuration window, select the plugins tab and then select telescope control. If load at startup isn't already checked, go ahead and check that box, and then you'll need to close and restart Stellarium and come back again to this configuration window to the telescope control. Once you've done that, the configure button should be enabled. So go ahead and click on the configure button. This brings up the telescopes window and shows a list of all the telescopes that are currently defined for Stellarium. Right now there aren't any, so we're going to go ahead and define one by clicking on the Add a New Telescope button. And here we're going to specify that the telescope is controlled by ASCOM. We're going to give the telescope a name, and in this case I'm going to call it ECBOX because I'm using my own Digital Setting Circles system here with Stellarium. It's commonly referred to as the ECBOX. I'm going to scroll down a little farther and click on Choose ASCOM Telescope. This brings up the ASCOM Telescope Chooser, And in this window, we're going to select from the available telescope drivers that have been installed for ASCOM, and in this case, tangent compatible digital setting circles is what we want to use. Click on the Properties button, and then we'll specify all the different settings for the Digital Setting Circles ASCOM driver. Some of these settings are optional. The telescope name, description, the mount type is optional. This system doesn't really care what type of mount you have. The focal length, the aperture diameter, and area are all optional. The important stuff starts in the encoder info section. Make sure to choose the correct interface type. In this case, I'm choosing DaveX Digital Setting Circles, but you can see that there are a number of other settings that you can use as well. So choose the setting that's appropriate for the type of digital setting circles system that you have. Next, specify the encoder resolutions on each of the two telescope axes. Make sure that you get these correct, otherwise the system will not work as expected. Typically, an encoder has a counts per revolution rating. Oftentimes it's 1000 or 1024. You would typically multiply that number by 4 in order to get the number of ticks per revolution, because we use the encoders in quadrature mode. If you have gears between your telescope and your encoder, you'll have to factor into account the gear ratio as well. Next, select the serial port. You might have to look at the device manager in order to determine which serial port is being used by your Digital Setting Circles system. And then you can check or uncheck the reverse encoder counts boxes on the altitude and azimuth axes. Typically, you would not check the altitude box, but you might have to check the azimuth box. And if you're not sure, you can either determine this by trial and error, or you can click the test button. If you have your system powered up and ready to be communicated with, you can click test, and it will guide you through the steps to determine whether you need to check the reverse azimuth checkbox. So here are some instructions here. It says, before continuing, make sure your telescope interface is turned on and connected, and the interface type and port are specified correctly. So go ahead and click OK. And now follow the instructions. It says turn your telescope 10 or 20 degrees in azimuth from north towards west if you have a Dobsonian mount, or toward greater right ascension if you have an equatorial mount, then click OK. So I'm going to do that and click OK. And it says you need to reverse the encoder counts on the RAS axis. So click OK to accept that message, and then check or uncheck depending upon what the results of your particular test were. And then finally, set the site info, specifically the latitude and the longitude. The elevation isn't used. The latitude and longitude should be set to the same values as were set in Stellarium itself. So remember, a few minutes ago I told you to make a note of those coordinates, enter those same coordinates here. You can leave Enable Trace unchecked. We only check that if we want some debug output to help us solve problems. Once we're done here, click the OK button. Click the OK button again here in the telescope chooser. And finally, click OK in Add New Telescope. You can also, at this point, close the configuration window if you'd like. That leaves us with the telescopes window. Now you can see our telescope listed in the telescopes controlled window, and the status is disconnected. So we're going to click the Connect button, and it's going to walk us through the process of aligning the telescope with Stellarium so that we can tell where we are pointing. So go ahead and click the Connect button, and there are 4 steps to the alignment process. The first step is to move the scope to 0 degrees altitude. So that means for a Dobsonian mount, point it parallel to the ground at the horizon. For an equatorial mount, point it to approximately 0 degrees in declination, which is pointing at the celestial equator. Then go ahead and click the Continue button. So I'm going to do that right now, pointing my telescope, clicking Continue. The next step is to move the scope to 90 degrees in altitude. So now, if you have a Dobsonian mount, point it at the zenith directly overhead. For an equatorial mount, point it at the celestial pole. And then again, click Continue. So I'm going to go ahead and change my telescope position like that. Click the Continue button. And now we're going to choose 2 alignment stars to complete the alignment. It's important when you choose these alignment stars that the stars not be too close to the celestial poles, and they should be fairly well separated in the sky. That'll give you the best alignment. So I'm going to start with a star in Andromeda, Merak. I'm going to click on that star to say that that's the one I'm aligning on, and now I'm going to point my telescope precisely at that star so that it's centered in my field of view. You can use a high-powered eyepiece if you can for this particular step. That will give you better results. So my telescope now is pointing at this star. I'm going to click the Continue button. And then I'm going to choose my second alignment star, and for this one I'm going to go to the constellation of Gemini, and I'm going to select Pollux as my second alignment star. I'm going to move my telescope so that it points there, and then I'm going to click the OK button, and this should complete the two-star alignment process. I'm going to click OK, and now you see that a cursor has appeared showing where my telescope is pointed, and it's pointing at Pollux, which was my second alignment star. Now that the alignment is complete, I can close the telescope's window. I'm going to move my telescope around a little bit, and you can see that as I do, the telescope cursor follows the telescope motion. Got to be a little careful here. There we go. Moving it too fast. I'll move it on the other axis as well. So you can see that the cursor follows my telescope around on the screen as I move my telescope around in the sky. If I want to find a particular target now in my telescope, what I can do is use Stellarium to select that target and then specify a slew to that position. So let's just say that I want to find the little beehive cluster here. I'm going to click on that to select it in Stellarium, and you can see now that in the top left corner of the screen I have information about that target. Now I'm going to go down to the bottom menu, which you get just by moving your mouse towards the bottom of the screen, and I'm going to select Move a Telescope to a Given Set of Coordinates. I'm going to open that window, and I can either specify the coordinates manually, or I can specify the current object. So I'm going to do that, and that will put the coordinates for the little beehive cluster into the right ascension and declination windows. And now I'm going to click the slew button to slew the telescope there. Now my mount doesn't have any motors, and chances are if you're using a Digital Setting Circles system, yours doesn't either. So what the Digital Setting Circles ASCOM driver does for me is give me a feedback window so that as I move my mount manually, I can tell whether I'm getting closer or farther away from my target. So what I want to do is make these two numbers go to 0 by moving my telescope. So I'm going to start moving the telescope, and if the numbers increase, then I'm moving in the wrong direction. So I'm going to move first on this axis, and then the other axis. So you can see as the numbers get closer to 0, my cursor gets closer to my target. And there we are. I am centered on the target more or less. And I'm going to click the close button. And I have found my target. So what happens if my target isn't in my field of view in my telescope after I've done a slew? Well, the sad fact is that telescopes and digital setting circles systems are not perfect. They will experience some inaccuracies in some parts of the sky, but we can perform a sync in order to compensate for that and give us better accuracy in certain regions. So in this particular case, what I might do is take my telescope and manually, by eye, point it such that it's centered on Sirius. And I'm going to move my telescope and do that right now. So that is the location that the telescope thinks it's at, but it's actually pointing directly at Sirius. So I'm going to click on Sirius to select it as my target. And now I'm going to go to the slew telescope window, click on current object to get Sirius's coordinates in the window, and I'm going to click this time on sync. And what that's going to do is tell the whole system that I'm really pointing at Sirius and not where it thinks I'm pointing. So I'm going to click on Sync. And now you can see that the telescope has more or less centered on Sirius. Now I can go back and click on the little beehive cluster again and put that in my current object window and click on Slew, and then move my telescope using the feedback window. And get it centered again. And now the little beehive cluster should be pretty much centered in the field of view of my telescope. Now I can close the feedback window again, and I'm all set to look at the little beehive cluster. So those are the two main functions that the Digital Setting Circles driver provides. First, you can slew to targets, and then you can sync on targets so that your accuracy is improved in a particular part of the sky. You can close the slew telescope window now, or you can also click the Configure Telescopes button, and when you are finished, you can click the Disconnect button to disconnect the telescope, and now you can close Stellarium. So that's how to use the Digital Setting Circles ASCOM driver with Stellarium and your telescope.